Hello, my name is Joe Follansbee. I'm the author of a science fiction series of books that asks how we will live on an Earth changed by a warming climate. The series is called Tales from a Warming Planet. The first book is titled The Mother Earth Insurgency. In this novelette, a government agent infiltrates a terrorist group bent on destroying a launch tower 20 kilometers tall, killing thousands. I'd like to read the entire story to you in this video. I hope you enjoy my presentation. The Mother Earth Insurgency by J.G. Follansbee, winner of an honorable mention in the 2017 Writers of the Future contest. Read by the author. Copyright 2017 Joseph G. Follansbee and Fit-Eye Media. All rights reserved. For Edith. Part 1. The rubber slug glanced off Nick Sorrow's cheekbone, gashing the skin deep enough to make a scar certain. It stung, but he welcomed the laceration. The blood infiltrating the stubble on his jaw hid his intent and reduced the chance he might hesitate. He stumbled forward, eyes on his quarry, a single individual ahead of him in the angry crowd. A surge carried him toward the police cordon, each officer's truncheon at the ready. He pressed his right hand to his bleeding cheek and his left hand on the backs and shoulders of other demonstrators to maintain his balance. He was part of the seething mass, but not with it. He chanted the protest slogans, but he didn't sing them as a true believer. Nick was like the nanobots that stalked free-floating cancer cells in the bloodstream. His target was John Janix. Could he stop Janix before his insurgents assassinated another green energy investor? Maybe Janix was after a Great Basin solar farm or one of his Santa Barbara tidal energy converters. Nick had to know. Debris sailed over his head from the protesters behind him. Cops launched tear gas canisters in response. Nick kept his one eye not obscured by swelling skin and sticky mucus on the man with a 10-centimeter hairless scar on his scalp. Janix was a predator, like a tiger or a snake, invisible in his hideouts, staying quiet until he struck. Nick had caught up to him after weeks of following his trail, but doubts dogged the undercover agent. The protest was perfect cover, but would he recognize the time to act? Would he have the nerve? Like a seawall, the triple line of cops protected the entrance to the hotel where the consortium CEOs were meeting. The officers' faces were determined but fearful behind their masks. Raindrops glittered like jewels on their helmets. The sergeant droned at the marchers about clearing the area. On either end of the cordon, anchoring it like buttresses, stood the security bots, their ostrich-like bodies sharpening the atmosphere of incipient violence. Nick was about to grab a handful of Janix's vinyl jacket when the terrorist reached for the semi-automatic pistol in the jacket's pocket. His hands centimeters from the weapon, Janix was seconds from taking out a cop or a demonstrator and transforming the raucous protest into a full-blown riot. It didn't make sense, though. Janix was smarter than that. Nick weighed his options, let the gun go off and keep his cover, or stop Janix there and then. He'd resist the latter choice until the last second, but he'd waited too long once before, and it had cost lives. A concussion grenade detonated at Janix's feet. Nick's army training kept him focused, but acrid smoke and orange sparks enveloped Nick and Janix and a half a dozen other demonstrators. A security bot emerged from the cloud, its spike-like staser deployed, the hiss-hiss of its actuators as terrifying as the deadly energy weapon. Nick's ears rang like a church bell as he spun around looking for Janix, finding him sprawled on the asphalt. The cops charged, changing the equation. Nick fell forward, feigning injury and crawling toward Janix. The prone man waved to ward off the truncheons that swung like swords. Nick raised an arm over Janix protectively, and a club landed on the back of his hand. Pain shot through his arm and into his ribs, but his eyes were on Janix's gun hand, which was empty. Another cloud of tear gas floated over them, and Nick snagged Janix's jacket with his bloody fingers. A second line of police rushed forward. Two pounced on Nick and Janix, screaming, "Get down," pushing both men's faces into the wet pavement. The laceration on Nick's cheek screamed painful orders to run and hide from the helmeted demons, but he locked his arm around Janix because his mission mattered more than a few cuts and bruises. The officers patted down every inch of their prizes and turned out every pocket. Nick had no weapons, and neither did Janix. The gun was lost after the grenade knocked everyone senseless. Cuffs went on the men's wrists, and they were hauled to their feet. For the first time, Nick met Janix face to face. "You okay, brother?" Janix's ice-like blue eyes regarded Nick. "What's it to you?" "I saw you go down. Solidarity, my friend." The cops told the arrested perps to shut up and pushed them toward the curb. A dozen other arrested protesters sat with knees to their chests or legs splayed out in front. All were cuffed at the elbows and wrists. A medic tended to scrapes and cuts. Nick's looked worse than it was. The agent kept his attention on Janix as the target studied his surroundings. Dossiers give you a lot of facts about targets, but they don't say anything about their souls. Accustomed to making snap judgments, Nick pegged Janix as everything he'd expected: ruthless, murderous, and utterly without fear or feeling. He set out to become Janix's next volunteer. The paddy wagon transported Nick and Janix to an empty school gym. The cops expected hundreds of arrests from the protest and the anarchistic opponents to the consortium, and its plan to consolidate clean energy didn't disappoint them. Nick stood behind Janix in a queue. "Been arrested before?" Janix barely turned to acknowledge Nick's question. "I was in Chicago and London," Nick said, "but I managed to avoid the cops. Seattle's the first time I've been busted." Janix ignored Nick. "It's kind of exciting, don't you think?" Janix's look of contempt would have melted lead. "I mean, no one wants to be arrested, I suppose, but it's like making a statement that you're willing to sacrifice for the cause, know what I mean?" Janix lifted a corner of his mouth. "Exactly what cause is that?" "Against corporate energy, the consortium, right? Inequality, everything." Nick offered a puzzled expression. "Against corporations, well, because they're corporations." The line shuffled toward a table. If Nick had the luxury of breaking character, he would have laughed at his silly pablum about corporate power. Good companies had hired his mother to make sure the carbon laws were followed after the string of Cat 5 hurricanes during the year of storms remade Florida into an archipelago. And Angela, his ex-wife, had gotten an engineering job with Spacelift. She was rising fast, in a manner of speaking. A uniformed officer with 3 stripes on her sleeve asked each of the prisoners a few questions and touched a keypad. Licking his lips, Janix scanned the crowd as if searching for an escape route. Nick chatted with others in line, keeping one eye on Janix. As Janix answered the sergeant's standard questions, she watched his face and eyes. Folding her hands, she nodded to a flak-jacketed street officer who ordered Janix to a group of detainees separate from the mass of miscreants. Nick noted Janix's anxiety. He'd relieve it soon if Janix took the bait. When Nick's turn came to answer the seated officer's questions, he delivered the ones he'd planned, along with his controller at the Bureau of Environmental Security. He prayed the identity database had been modified. He hadn't time to double-check the BES records. The officer tapped the keys, and Nick forced back a sigh of relief when he was taken to the segregated group. In front of Janix, he feigned his own anxiety. "What the fuck?" he whispered. "They want to ask me some more questions. Is that what she said to you?" Nick's target wavered, as if uncertain whether to share his nervousness with a stranger. Nick had taken a blow with a billy club to protect a brother. Maybe he'd feel a sense of gratitude, so Nick hoped. Yeah, questions, Janix said. What sort of questions? Janix folded his arms and turned away, ending the dialogue. One by one, the other segregated detainees went through a door marked men's locker room, whether they were male or female. None came out. With one detainee left before Janix's turn came, Nick nudged him. The target regarded Nick as he might an insect. Hey, brother, this is kind of a last resort, but I think I can get us out of here in one piece. Fuck off. The cops missed this. With a quick move, Nick reached down into his crotch and pulled out a flat, flexible piece of plastic small enough to hide in the palm of his hand. Holding it close to his body, he ran his finger along one edge, and text characters flowed in. Janix's attitude changed 180 degrees. He was curious. What are you doing? What's your universal ID number? My what? Come on, man, we've only got a couple of minutes. Clearing his throat, Janix gave it to him. Now I'll enter mine, Nick said, tapping the plastic without a sound. Okay, listen to me. When the cops start talking to you, tell them this. Nick wove a lie, but he knew the outcome. Why should I trust you? You want to end up in the hole? Janix considered the possibility of imprisonment. He nodded his thanks, and then he smiled. It hooked you, as sure as a wriggling worm triggered a fish's urge to strike. A plainclothes detective came for Janix. Nick offered a tiny grin to give his quarry confidence and ward off his charisma. A few minutes later, the detective came for Nick, and the incognito agent told his own lie. The detective tapped at his version of the police sergeant's keyboard. The cops released Nick, sending him out a side door. Night had fallen, and Nick was blind in the darkness. An arm shoved him into the concrete wall, opening up the cut on his face. For an instant, Nick was back in the mountains of South Asia with an extremist mullah in his face. Janix had the same look, as if he'd slice you open from navel to neck and sleep like a baby 10 minutes later. No smile here. Who the fuck are you? Janix spat in Nick's ear and wrenched Nick's wrist. What do you want? Hey man, that hurts. Nick's wrist was close to breaking. I'm just trying to help. We're supposed to help each other, all for the cause. You fucked with the records. How? Christ, you can download anything off the dark com. I have a skill or two, Nick said. The BES had its own tricks. You're annoying me. What if I killed you right now? Nick managed a shrug. Not exactly an expression of gratitude. He smelled his target's breath, dark and heavy with cynicism. With a push, Janix stepped back and walked away. Nick watched his tall, thin body dissolve into the night. He was ready to deliver his punchline. Hey, John. Janix kept going. Stay away from me. I've been looking for you for months. Janix halted. He flexed his fingers as if debating whether to close them around a throat. The target took another step. Nick took on a different mane. I know who you are. I want to be part of the insurgency. Part 2. Nick followed Janix to the parking lot a few blocks from the gym, and when the public self-driving car arrived, Nick stood close. He couldn't force his way in, but he waited for an invitation. It came, though Janix programmed the car's destination. Where are we going? One of Janix's trademarks was his network of spider holes. Nick's controller wanted to know where he was going next, or at least where Nick's bullet-riddled body might be dumped. You'll see. Nick checked the onboard water stash. Empty. You'd think our tax dollars would at least keep a couple of bottles around in an emergency. What if we break down in the middle of the new desert? The mid-continent desertification hadn't reached this far west, but maybe Janix would respond to humor. You talk a lot, Sorrows. That's Soros. Really? May I call you Nick? He was the opposite of cordial. Of course. Nick decided not to annoy Janix with chattiness. The terrorist ignored Nick for the rest of the trip, though the hairs on his arm tingled with the occasional glance. As part of his cover, Nick masked his always-on digital identity, which was broadcast through his mind's eye comm implants. Anyone could access him through the worldwide communication network, but his real identity was buried deep in the Bureau of Environmental Security's servers. No security protocol was perfect, but no government or private group had penetrated BES's servers. At least, that's what the techie said. He sent his status to BES headquarters in Eugene. The encoded acknowledgement returned within seconds. Janek's identity was masked as well, but Nick had already infiltrated the layers of false and anonymized identities. That's how he tracked Janek's to Seattle. The leader of the Mother Earth Insurgency glanced again in Nick's direction, as if checking on a sudden insight, but Nick's confidence in his digital veil held. It need only last until he knew Janek's target. Then he'd disappear. He hoped his BES defenses would last. He'd never gone this deep into a case before, but Janek's had already blown other agents' covers. Nick was the last arrow in the quiver. As the car cruised south, the possible destinations narrowed to one, Takilma. After an all-night drive, the public car turned left onto Oregon 46, then left again onto the road that hugs the East Fork of the Illinois River. An old mining settlement in a narrow mountain valley, Takilma was populated by hippies, artists, black market misproducers, and assorted misfits. The car halted in front of a building at least 200 years old. The unpainted, rough-hewn siding had bleached to the color of a sweat-soaked t-shirt. The floorboards creaked like an elderly cat. The most recent exterior decor was a solar panel mounted on a steel pole streaked with rust. A bell and a door tinkled, and Nick smelled lavender and beeswax. He also smelled wood smoke, but that was impossible. Wood burning was banned under the carbon laws. On the store's half-bare shelves, no national brand names or packages screamed for attention. Instead, labels announced handmade, true organic, locally grown, or no waste. There was honey in jars with red and white checked lids, peanut butter cookies with crosshatches made by forks, and fresh loaves of bread piled in a wicker basket. Stuck on the basket rim was a hand-lettered sign that read, €2 a loaf for 30 minutes chopping wood at Mama's place. "Can I help you?" The raspy voice belonged to a fit, gray-haired man about 70 in faded overalls. His full beard featured a single thin ponytail that reached down to his navel. His face scrunched in recognition and sadness, as if he saw a terrible future. "John Janek's." "Good to see you again, Bobcat." Near the old man was a 6-inch square of plywood with painted letters, "We have no gas, so don't ask." No one had sold gasoline anywhere for a dozen years. "You're looking for Georgia," Bobcat stated the fact with a sigh. "Is she here?" "I'm here." A woman in her late 20s pushed aside a bead curtain. Nick's heart stopped. He recognized Georgia Napoli from the mugshots, but nothing prepared him to see her in person. Dark, curly hair cascaded past loam eyes and high cheekbones, down her neck to the point where her breasts began their forward thrust. Her threadbare shirt draped over a muscular frame that could snap Nick in two, in a fight or in bed. She reminded him of a girl in high school who gave him a hard-on just by winking at him. She ignored Nick's gape and kissed Janek's, lingering a full 10 seconds, pressing her body against her lover's. Bobcat scratched his head in embarrassment. Even Nick had to avert his eyes. The old man broke the spell. "Would you like some coffee? Just got some beans from Colombia. Direct trade, the good stuff." "Is the old group still around?" Janek said, pushing Georgia off and introducing Nick. Bobcat eyed the new visitor with practiced skepticism. "Most of them, but there's been changes. Let's go over to the hotel and see Mama." Georgia clasped Janek's hand. Nick followed them down a gravel road, and the illegal smoke drifted through the tree canopy. Through a break, Nick saw the smoke's source, a dozen tents and shelters in a clearing. Refugees, Georgia noted Nick's curiosity. They're coming up here now to avoid the BES. From where? All over. The storm's going back years. They're all victims of one sort or another. The '54 tsunami topped all the seawalls from Eureka to Coos Bay. A lot of them are BES evacuees. After the year of storms and the carbon laws banning anything that put more carbon in the atmosphere, the Bureau of Environmental Security encouraged, that was the official word, people in low-lying areas to follow preventive evacuation advice. As BES units watched, columns of displaced people from the storms and the evacuations streamed away from the coasts. The evacuations troubled Nick. He had seen similar marches in South Asia. Thousands were buried along those routes. A minority were victims of the plague of insurgencies. Fewer refugees died on North America's evacs, but the miseries struck him as unjust and unnecessary. This was an advanced country. Couldn't the government help them where they lived? It's been years since the last evacuations, Nick said. How do they survive? Scrounging, luck, theft. Theft from whom? Children played around the tents. He captured images using his mind's eye camera, integrated into his comm implants behind his ear. But when he tried to upload them to storage, the network was unavailable. None of his hosts showed avatars. Holes in the ComNet coverage were uncommon, but not unheard of. The gravel road widened at a large house as old and weathered as the store, if more structurally stable and well-maintained to Nick's untrained eye. Huge Douglas fir trees loomed over the house as if guarding it. Flowers and planters pushed their way through last year's decay. A thin, older woman stuck her head out the building's door and jumped back in. A second later, several people of various ages scrambled out to greet Georgia and Janix, scattering a flock of chickens as they ran. It was like the reunion of an extended family. Nick was the outsider. The woman, whose given name was Jessica Santorini, embraced Nick warmly. About the same age as Bobcat, she was wiry with sun-baked skin on her arms and face. Flyaway hair gave her a wild air. The apron over the front of her ankle-length dress was dusted with flour. Her eyes were the color of purple irises. A girl of 5 tugged at Georgia's pants leg. She scooped up the child and perched her on her hip, as if she took care of children all day long. "I can smell the apple pie," Georgia said to the child. "Do you want some?" The child nodded vigorously. She walked up the hotel's steps with the child, leaving Nick gaping again. It was impossible for him not to think of Angela and his son, Jason. "Are you coming in?" Georgia said. The hotel was an old bunkhouse for miners and loggers. Mama Jess arrived decades ago and fixed up the abandoned building. "I've been here 30 years and we've built a tight little community. We don't take more from the land than she can give, but things can get a little tense sometimes, especially with the refugees." A hunting rifle was set in a case near the door. To discourage theft, Nick guessed. Georgia and Janix took places at a table big enough for a dozen adults. The 5-year-old sat between them. Nick found a corner. Mama Jess set plates and a pair of pies on the table. "Why do they call you Mama?" Nick said. "I have a bad habit of taking in strays," she said, winking at him. The agent bit into the still warm pie. Thoughts of past missions, refugees from the warming, and a failed marriage fell away. "Well now, Nick," Mama said, "how are you with a splitting mall?" "A what?" Nick wasn't sure what Mama meant, though her question drove away the seductive mood encouraged by the pie and coffee. "You didn't think I'd just hand out food to my foundlings, do you?" Nick was soon behind the hotel, turning a pile of fresh-sawn alder logs into firewood. He felt as if he'd been maneuvered into buying a car that he didn't want. Around him, the wood smoke hung in the air like a diaphanous shroud. It seemed the Bureau hadn't sent any enforcers to Takelma. Keeping faith with his undercover role, he blended in. His dismay at the refugees' situation melted into the satisfaction of hard work. He thought of his Special Forces fitness training and how good he felt after a 5K run. After one evening run, a few weeks after he and Angela were married, he'd found her home early from school. They made love as only military spouses do, as if it were the last time. 5 weeks later, he was on his second deployment. The mission precluded communication with Angela. Nick shook his head to dismiss the memory. He tried to access the network again, with no luck. "Anything wrong?" Georgia held out a glass of water. "Nothing, thanks," Nick sipped, noticing how Georgia's eyes scanned his soldier's frame. The next morning, the group gathered around the table again. Everyone seemed rested and talkative, with the Takelma children rambunctiously hungry. Mama Jess set out plates of blueberry pancakes, fried eggs, and bacon. A new arrival sat at the table, a 20-ish man with blonde dreads who introduced himself as Squirrel. He wore the Circle A of the anarcho-punk tattooed over his right bicep. Patches and repairs crisscrossed his clothes, marking him as one of the refugees, unlike the neat, if recycled clothes of the Takelmans, who tolerated him. Nick suspected he was also on the run. "Today," Mama announced, "we're going to take down the tree that's giving us some trouble." Bobcat came to the door with a 6-foot, 2-handled crosscut saw. He also carried a large double-bladed axe, a sledgehammer, and some wooden wedges. "Squirrel, I'll need your help," Bobcat said. "Nick, Mama says you can swing an axe, so I'd appreciate you coming along too." Nick looked up and down the table. Where's John? Had he muffed his job to run down the insurgency's target? Errands, Georgia had put her hair up. The style framed an oval face. He's the only one among us with a valid license for renting public cars. Everyone followed Bobcat to a thinly wooded area behind the barn where the milk cow lived. A few puffy clouds decorated the sky, and the temperature was already climbing. Bobcat regarded a fir tree that Nick guessed was 15 meters tall with a trunk half a meter in diameter near the base. He saw the problem. The tree had a perceptible lean toward the barn. Dirt was lifted around its roots, as if something had pushed on the trunk in an attempt to bring it down. "We had a windstorm a few weeks ago," Mama explained. "Another good wind and it'll fall over and destroy the barn. We can't have that." Bobcat studied every inch of the trunk, the ground around the roots, and the lower branches. He addressed his 2 recruits, gesturing to the tools. "Have you ever done this before?" Nick and Squirrel shook their heads. "It's not hard, but you have to be very careful. Many a logger's been killed up here by carelessness. Follow my instructions and direction exactly, okay? I'll do the thinking, and you'll do the sawing. My arthritis won't let me help with the heavy work." Bobcat laid out his plan in several steps. "Now, before you start working, plan your escape route, just in case something goes wrong." "Escape?" Nick said. "It's where you'll run if the tree falls in your direction." Squirrel had the smooth voice of a singer who had just finished his warm-up exercises. "This thing weighs 2 or 3 tons, and the big branches weigh 50 kilos or more," Bobcat said. "They'll crush you like a bug." "Thus the hard hats." Nick nodded at the 3 yellow hats Georgia held. Bobcat picked up an axe. "Bob, wait, please," Mama said. "We need to pay our respects." "Yes, of course." "Gather round," Mama said. The small group drew close and held hands. Mama held Nick's left hand while his right hand was in Georgia's left. He worried his was damp. She grinned at him. Mama Jess closed her eyes. "I would like us all to thank this beautiful piece of Mother Earth's creation for growing here and giving shelter and food to the animals and birds for so many years. We are sorry to have to bring it down to protect our home and our family, but we want the tree and the earth to know that we respect it and that its wood will warm our house for many months to come. And we say thank you to it." With that, Mama squeezed Nick's hand, and he found himself squeezing George's. Bobcat put on his hard hat. Nick and Squirrel followed suit. Now let's move everyone back about 10 meters for safety. Bobcat swung the double-bladed axe and carefully removed the bark at a spot on the trunk about waist-high on the side opposite the tree's lean. Squirrel took one end of the crosscut saw and Bobcat the other. The elder man positioned it, and the two slowly drew the saw back and forth until it had bitten tightly into the trunk. The saw was razor-sharp, and it cut deep with each draw. Bobcat switched places with Nick, and the two younger men drew the saw in tandem, slowly at first, then more quickly as they found a rhythm. After about 15 minutes, Bobcat called halt to the cutting, and the younger men pulled out the saw. The elder man marked an imaginary line slicing down at a 45-degree angle to the first cut. Again, with Squirrel's help, he started the second cut. After a few draws, Nick's crosscut dance with Squirrel began again. A perfectly formed wedge fell away from the trunk. "All right, Nick," Bobcat said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief and flexing his rheumatic fingers. "I'll start one of these wedges into this third cut behind the wedge. You'll know what to do next." Nick picked up the sledge. It had a 5-kilo head. He understood what would happen, and the excitement stoked his energy. Taking aim, he hit the wedge square, driving it about a half-inch into the third cut. With a will and a wide sweep with the hammer, Nick drove the wedge further and further into the tree. His mind drifted with the repetitions. His controller's instructions echoed as the sledge pounded. The intel is too fragmented. What's Janek's target? Get in there, and a crack punctured Nick's thoughts. Bobcat barked, "Shit, scatter, boys!" Nick dropped the hammer and ran perpendicular to the trunk's slant. He heard a thump behind him. The tree was still up, but a 5-centimeter dead branch had broken off and landed near the place where he'd been standing. He stared at the spot nonchalantly as he could, frightened that he would have been killed if he hadn't moved. His eye caught George's. She watched him as if through a sniper's scope. "Good," Bobcat said. "I'm hoping that's the weakest branch and we'll be safe from falling branches for a while." Nick took up his position and attacked the wedge again. His arms trembled as much from scare as the hard labor. He heard another, louder crack. It came from the trunk. "Out of the way, boys!" A final moan from the stressed wood signaled the tree's death. Bending toward the removed wedge, the trunk landed with a whump between two other firs of similar height, bringing down some of its companions' branches. Broken twigs, fir needles, and bits of lichen drifted down like heavy snow. The group around Mama Jess raised a cheer. Nick took off his hard hat and bowed. A middle-aged stranger in rags stood near Bobcat. "You gonna use that wood?" The elder regarded the evacuee. "Not sure yet. We'll cut it up for firewood. Winter is long up here, for everyone." Another man and a teenage boy came up. Bobcat turned to face them. "The deadfall in the hills is better. This wood is green. It'll need to dry." "We've already used most of the dead trees nearby." The man waved at the log. "It's more than you could burn in a year. We just want some of it." Jess stood next to Bobcat. "We don't want any trouble." The Takilmans with kids moved back. "You've got more than enough. Our legal fuel aid from the UN is almost gone." The tension rose with each sentence, like a call and response. Nick saw no weapons, although the axe in Bobcat's hand reeked of menace. The standoff brought back another scene on Nick's first deployment, when an extended family approached his patrol begging for food. The captain was nervous. Another group of refugees had attacked the patrol the day before. As tensions rose, a local cleric intervened, suggesting tea. They reached an agreement. "We all want the same thing," Nick said, echoing the remembered cleric. "We all want to keep warm this winter." All eyes turned to Nick. "Maybe our friends," he gestured at the newcomers, "would be willing to lend a few men in trade for half the wood. Many hands and all that." Jess nodded. "I'm for that." Bobcat agreed. Nick offered a spare axe to the middle-aged man, and with Bobcat they discussed the best approach to sectioning the log. The tension diffused, but Nick wondered if he'd made a mistake. His mission was observe and report, not prevent an altercation in a remote village, not that different from another mountain village far away that didn't survive the fight over dying land. Nice work, Soros, for a first-timer. John Janix stood by himself, gazing directly at Nick. He checked his feeling of pleasure at Janix's words, which were tinged with criticism. It was a classic whipsaw technique to gain control, offer praise, then snatch it away, leaving the victim wanting it even more. The butt of a shotgun rested on Janix's hip, the gun's long barrel pointing skyward, a more concrete threat. Nick swallowed. Had he been discovered? Or was Janix a threat that kept the refugees in line? The terrorist reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a box of shells. Here you go, Bobcat. Bring us back a duck or two this time. He handed the old man the gun and the shells, though his eye never left Nick. Georgia brushed against the BES agent. John likes you. The thrill of her touch took 20 minutes to dissipate. Nick bathed at Bobcat's place, and he luxuriated in the hot water. The anxieties of the tree felling sloughed off his psyche. He had never felt so fit. In the unlikely event that Janix had guessed his true purpose, he had scoped out escape routes while he, Squirrel, and the refugees cut up the log. The network was still down. Nick wondered if the Tekilman's back-to-nature attitude encouraged more active ways to keep the outside world at arm's length. After an evening supper of rice, beans, and home-canned vegetables, the group took up residence in the hotel's parlor, a large room with a high ceiling covered in painted tin tiles. None of the thrift shop upholstered furnishings had so much as a thread out of place. An old boombox played reggae. Bobcat reached into his pocket and removed a worn tin box. Inside were homemade mist sticks. Strictly speaking, only the government could sell the narcotic, but home brewers were rampant. Nick demurred, but Janix took a hit. He was fidgety. Squirrel offered him a beer. He sipped it like a man itching to speak his mind. What's wrong, John? Redolent of a painter's model, Georgia relaxed on the Persian carpet. He's restless. Bobcat stroked the long braid that hung from his chin. We're boring him. Mama Jess studied Janix from an easy chair. Spit it out, son. I'm not bored, I'm restless. What's on your mind? Bobcat said. The problem with ideas is that they're pointless unless they are followed by action. Janix's voice rose in pitch. Talk is cheap. If the energy corporations understood ideas, the consolidations would have stopped. People would have direct control over their energy resources. That's what this demonstration in Seattle was about. They hated concentration of energy resources in the hands of a few, just like the old oil companies. Squirrel nodded in the way you agree with something you've believed in since childhood. Bobcat chewed on his mystic. Before the carbon laws, people tried to persuade folks to stop using fossil fuels because they were harming the planet. It took 3 or 4 seasons of man-killing Cat 5 hurricanes and months of deep freezes to finally convince the majority. It was hard not to shout, "We warned you." I read the history, but the dream died, Janix said. Back when fossil fuels were king, you could have a wind generator on your property or solar panels on your roof. You could be independent. What if the refugees were given the tools to survive instead of told to leave their homes? It startled Nick how much he agreed with Janix. You can't win every argument, Bobcat said. People decided to give up such things to a corporation. At least we're not burning coal or oil any longer. It's just wrong, Georgia said. Just a few people and corporations have all the power. We don't need CEOs and presidents. And there's the Space Launch Tower. It's just for rich people who don't care about poor people who are left behind. They'd rather go into orbit than do the right thing on Earth. Average people always suffer. Look at the refugees on our front yard. The mention of spacelift took Nick by surprise. His ex-wife Angela was on the project, and she'd been offered an apartment on one of the residential levels below the launch platform. The consortium financiers were selling square footage as luxury residences, like vacation homes near a cruise ship dock at 65,000 feet. She'd brought Jason with her. The boy loved the idea, and Nick had okayed it. What did Georgia have in mind? Janix got up from his creaky chair. When fossil fuels were finally banned, people dreamed of an energy grid with human beings at the center, not megacorporations. The wind generators and the solar farms were once a blessing, now they're a blight. It's turned into another way to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. The government is just as bad. It's never been for the people. I'm tired of the corrupts giving more away to the corporates. It needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. Nick wanted to say, "What are you going to do about it, John Janix?" That's why he was in Takelma. He waited for an answer. I know what to do. I can make change happen. Who's with me? George's face was reverential, as if she were gazing on a larger-than-life work of art. Easy, John, Mama Jess was more skeptical. You argue passionately. I'll bet you were this way when you were a lawyer. But you need to be careful where you're going. Have you heard of Dave Foreman? Janix said, addressing no one in particular. Squirrel nodded. Bobcat sniffed. I've heard of him. My granddad knew him. Then you know about Earth First and monkey wrenching. Yes, I do, the old man said. I may have observed the practice once or twice a long time ago. It's time we took down a wind generator, like we took down that tree today, or sank a tender for the tidal stations. Georgia put her hand in her lover's, as if to stop him from saying too much. Believing and talking is only half the war, Janix said. The other half is doing something. Tell me what you're going to do. Nick prayed for an answer. Once he had it, he could exit. John, it doesn't work, Bobcat said. We tried it a long time ago, back when the logging companies were mowing down forests like grass. It slows down the companies and the government for about a minute, and things go right back to normal. And if something goes wrong, the cops follow you until you're worn down to nothing. I know. Nick's mouth went dry. You're an old man, cautious and foolish. Janix stood up and pointed to the east. The people in New York West and the capital laugh at us. They call people like you bug huggers. Frankly, I have trouble seeing much difference between you and the corporates. Maybe that's what you are, a corporate bug hugger, co-opted by the companies and the politicians into passiveness as they rape Mother Earth. John, Georgia squeezed Janix's hand to appease his anger. Be respectful. He's an elder here. It's all right, Georgia, Bobcat said. No, I love you like my grandfather, Georgia said. She turned to Janix, eyes ablaze. Will you apologize? Janix sighed, glanced at Georgia, and then Bobcat, who studied the younger man with eyes saddened by the years. I'm sorry, Janix said. Nick did not hear sincerity. Apology accepted, Bobcat said. I was a young man too, frustrated by the slow pace of change. Perhaps I've grown cautious. I think of it as patience more than caution. John's right, Squirrel said. Nothing ever changes. The group turned their attention to the blonde traveler as if he was a house cat that had acquired human speech. It's true. Squirrel straightened his back. There's a project up in the hills above Fortuna. Pretty area until a few months ago. You mean the wind farm? Mama Jess said. Yep, the consortium leased the land from the bankrupt timber company that owns it. The wind people have just about finished 3 big turbines. They're huge motherfuckers to take advantage of the onshore winds. Sounds like a perfect target, Janix said, as if confirming a decision rather than hearing the idea for the first time. It's obvious, Squirrel said. Big wind doing more big projects to make big profits. We need to show that profits belong to the people. On top of that, the consortium is turning a pristine view into an industrial eyesore. They've paid off the local people by building a school. The corporations are evil as ever. They're just more clever about it. That's what I think, anyway. Seems to me, Bobcat, that patience has failed, Janix said. The old man stood up from his easy chair. He ignored Squirrel and put his hand on Janek's shoulder. If you're thinking about acting on your beliefs, be very careful. Don't hurt anyone or you'll regret it your whole life. Sometimes people get hurt in a fight that matters, and sometimes people die, Bobcat said. If that happens again, will it be worth it to you? Again. Though Nick never heard the Takilma people mention Janek's murders and attacks, every look and gesture suggested they knew, at least the elders, such as Bobcat. They sympathized with him, but only to a point. Nick had no tolerance for murderers, and the BES couldn't wait for a lunatic like Janek's to age out of his deadly ways. Janek's didn't answer Bobcat's question. Instead, he took a breath and let it out slowly. You people are weak. I'm going to bed. He walked toward the stairs to the room he shared with Georgia. She rose and caught Bobcat's eyes, but he looked away. She went upstairs after her lover. Squirrel followed. Nick went after them as well. In the hall, the group conferred. I'm on your side, John, Squirrel said. I believe in what you're doing. I want to do something about the wind farm. What about you, Nick? Janek said. I'm in. I wouldn't be here if I weren't. Janek's and George's eyes met. They were secretly agreeing on something, or looking for support for one another. Squirrel said, Let's show the corporates that they don't own everyone. We can do it. It's time to teach the consortium a lesson, Janek said, as he shook the anarchist's hand. That smile again, like a beacon, or a false light that attracted ships to rocks where thieves waited. Nick wanted to warn Georgia away from Janek's path to self-destruction, but it worked against his mission. He licked his lips as the thin walls let the sounds of the lovers' exertions fill the space, like the moonlight that spread through the window. Another memory came, its distracting pain welcome. He was on his second deployment. He stalked the insurgent command post for a week. He waited for the right moment according to the rules of engagement, which forbade an attack if non-combatants were near. The moment came and he called in the strike. The terrorist leader was liquidated along with a dozen fighters. But Nick had waited a moment too long. As the missile flew, a young family living in the building came home. Nick had seen them, the couple as loving in public as their culture allowed. They were found buried in the rubble, crushed to death. Their 3 children survived. They sat on a curb in front of the collapsed building, covered in dust, like stones in a quarry. Nick could not stop his tears then or now. He feared making the same mistake again, with Georgia or the whole world. Part 3. There's something I can't quite figure out, Soros. Janeks cinched the packs onto the horses. Why are you here? I told you, I want to be part of the Mother Earth Insurgency. Nick set down canvas bags of gear. He had no idea how to load them on the animals, but Janeks had horse-camped as a teenager, according to his dossier. I agree that we missed an opportunity to really change things after the year of storms, but the BES and the government are just the same old, same old. I want real change. I'm talking about what you can do to help us make that happen. You saw what I did back at the gym in Seattle. That was only one of my tricks. As they lowered one of the big panniers on a pack saddle, the animal moved. Janeks lost his balance, but Nick got under the panniers, taking the weight and steadying it. The terrorist found his balance and tied the carrier down. Janeks nodded to Nick in thanks. It signaled the target's growing trust. What do you know about code breaking? I've done my fair share. Nick could bluff his way through basic cryptography. It depends on what you need. What about the codes that detonate a nuclear warhead? Nick kept his shock in check. He hadn't expected this. I'm not sure. I've never worked on one. There probably aren't 10 people alive who've worked on one, Janek said. If you mean you can't do it, I didn't say that. What I'm thinking about requires expert knowledge. If you don't think you can help, I've just never worked on that problem, John. Maybe this was the breakthrough he needed. Have you got an MK-54 in one of those bags? They're heavy enough. Janix didn't answer. You know what those are, right? Designed from the 1950s for a man-carried nuke. Successfully tested, but never used, of course. The Army called the system Davy Crockett, after the backwoodsman and congressman who fought in the Mexican War and died at the Alamo. Janix lost his serious look and slapped Nick on the back. You're a smart guy, Nick. George is smart too. I need smart people to fight the consortium. You're with me, right? Yeah. The terrorist's praise was a strange kind of comfort to Nick. Georgia and Squirrel arrived with their gear. Georgia packed a weapon on her back. A staser? Nick said. I'm rated, she said, or I would be if I was legit. Nick had fired a staser a few times in the Army, but specialists required a tough-to-get certification. The energy guns were expensive and powerful in the way that nukes were expensive and powerful. Is a SecBot coming along? They're the only ones who can use those things with the right precision. Oh, ye of little faith. Georgia unzipped a pocket of her jacket. Bend down, you too, Squirrel. Nick was taller than Georgia by about 15 centimeters, and she put a finger-length device on his skin behind his right ear. His comm access implants were underneath. Masker? With the masker in hand, she approached close enough for him to smell her warmth and homemade soap. No comm signals, no discovery. We're going off the comm grid for this trip. She did the same with Squirrel and herself. Nick's mind's eye display flashed in his visual cortex, an effect he'd never seen before. It triggered remembered details from George's dossier, a Master's of Information Systems design, a felony conviction for breaking into the International Monetary Fund's Swiss accounts, later set aside on appeal. She was 13 at the time. Doesn't John get the treatment? Nick said when she pocketed the device without approaching their leader. I need to make some connections on the way, John said before Georgia could answer. Nothing you need to know about. Don't you trust me, Nick? Nick couldn't argue without raising suspicions, but it meant he couldn't contact his controller for guidance or an extraction. He realized Georgia might have all of Takilma locked down. You're the boss. You're catching on. Janix led his animal forward, letting Georgia take the lead. They were for packing, not riding. Vehicles were too easy to track, and the group could stay off the roads. With Squirrel as rear guard, the Mother Earth Insurgency followed the last kilometer of paved road leading out of Takilma until it became a gravel track, then a well-worn trail. Spring had taken hold in the Siskiyou Mountains. The snow had melted and bright green leaves showed themselves on the alders and cottonwoods. The landscape and views relaxed Nick, despite the constant threat of discovery. He thought he might return to the area once his mission was done, maybe bring his son Jason. He forced himself back to the situation at hand. What was Janix's true intent? They were going to attack the wind farm, but the plan seemed too small for the leader's ambition. What was the nuclear codes question all about? A few minutes after sundown, the group arrived at the home of a man Nick judged to be in his 50s, who introduced himself to Nick and Squirrel as Tilton. Janix and Georgia already knew him. Chickens pecked for bugs in the front yard. Tilton wore a 9mm automatic on his hip. They sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee. A timber company bought the land I've been mining from the federal government after I filed a claim on it. I've been working that claim for decades. Tilton adjusted his camo cap. First the company, and now the consortium has been trying to kick me off. The feds aren't helping me, and lawyers, Tilton glared at Janix, aren't worth shit. Tilton poured a few drops of bourbon into his coffee. I'm nearly out of money. Selling this place won't cover my debts. If I sell, I'm homeless, living in one of your cities. Tilton said "your," as if Janix were an absentee landlord who squeezed his tenants bloodless. And I know all about you activist types. A lot of bluster and testosterone with a generous helping of stupidity. My granddad would have called you Reds and shot you on sight. The only reason I don't is because I can't spare the shells." "We're not like those activists," Janek said. Tilton laughed, the kind of laugh born of misery and failure. "Bullshit. But I'm going to help you because I hate the timber company, the consortium, and the feds more than you." "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," Nick said. He had no information on Tilton. He wasn't briefed on him, at least. "The enemy of my enemy is still my enemy," Tilton said. He downed his coffee in one swallow. Tilton selected a key from a peg near the front door. He led the group through the darkness to a shed 150 meters east of the house. As Georgia and Squirrel watched the countryside, he unlocked a padlock and lifted a flashlight from a shelf. He shined it on a cardboard box in the shed's pitch-dark interior. The box held 5 white plastic packages shaped like an Italian salami, labeled Celtex Maximus. Tilton handed one of the packages to Nick. The substance felt like clay. It weighed a couple of kilos. "It'll blow a 5-inch hole in steel plate an inch thick," Tilton said. Janek placed the packages in a backpack. Tilton reached to an upper shelf and brought down another box. Objects rolled around inside. The miner lifted the lid. His flashlight showed a dozen thin, finger-length tubular objects made of a red ceramic or enameled metal. One end was rounded like a test tube and the other flat with a blue top. Tilton gave one of the detonators to Janek. "Make a cut about a 1/2 inch long in the Celtex packaging," the miner said. "Push the detonator in all the way to the blue cap. Then remove this tab." Tilton pretended to grab a bit of plastic on the cap and snap it off. He described the next steps. "What if the detonator is bad?" Georgia said. "Can we have 2? "You get 1. It's not as though I can pick these up at the Tacoma store." Tilton sneered and pushed past Nick. That evening, Tilton invited the insurgents to stay the night, claiming that bears waking up after hibernation were more aggressive than usual this year. He was a lonely man, Nick concluded, and though he had little respect for the Mother Earth Insurgency's politics, he wanted some company. He broke out another bottle of bourbon. Squirrel, not a drinker, volunteered to watch for intruders. "Tilton, you and I have more in common than you think." Janek poured himself another drink. His grin was magnetic, like a preacher's. "We both hate the powers that be." "Should we hate them?" Nick sipped. "I mean, that kind of emotion gets in the way of your judgment. What's worse is indifference. That was my parents' attitude." Janek melted into Tilton's old couch. They were part of the acceptance movement. Nick knew all about Janek's family, but maybe he could draw him out, get at his inner mind, especially if liquor might loosen him up. Never heard of it. "You're an educated man, Soros. You know about Bible-thumping Christians. Everything bad is a judgment from God, even climate change." "I thought the fundamentalist Christian sects denied human-caused climate change." "Not this one." Janek studied the whiskey. "It broke away, a faction of a faction. I was raised to believe that man's wickedness was manifest in the climbing temps, and that God was using humanity's own greed to punish it." "I suppose that works at a logical level," Nick shrugged. "Where does the indifference come in?" "There was nothing you could do about it, so you ignored it." Georgia rolled her eyes. "I've heard this story." "Nothing you could do except follow God's law down to the commas and periods," Janek said. "Then you'd be saved, though how was never really explained." "The government is supposed to follow the Constitution, but it never does," Tilton said, as if recognizing one of the points in common. "The acceptance movement was good at rules. One day I came home from a haircut, and my father made me go back and get a cut again. 2 or 3 hairs were touching the top of my left ear." Janek put his finger on his ear. His wavy hair needed a comb. "After my mother died, he sold everything he owned and disappeared into the Montana Rockies to await Judgment Day. I haven't seen or heard from him in 6 or 8 years, not since law school." "Lawyers." Tilton prepped to take a swing at Janek, but Nick put a hand on the miner's chest. He was too drunk to act on his impulse. "Mother gave me a little money before she died. Dad was smart enough not to touch it, and I wasn't about to follow him into oblivion. I knew we could do something about climate change if we could just get the bad actors into court." Georgia set her cheek in her hand, bored. Let me tell you another story, Georgia Napoli. Janek stood up, wobbly but ready to argue his brief. There was once a lawyer, an environmental lawyer. He sued a company to stop it from building a factory. The factory would spew toxic waste into the air. People in the town said, no, we don't want a factory. He told a judge that the company had filled out the permit wrong. The company had forgotten something or other. The judge agreed and denied the permit. The factory was stopped. The people cheered. After the ruling, the lawyer for the company that wanted to build the factory went up to the winning lawyer and said, thank you. Now I know what we need to do to fix the permit application. The company wrote up a new permit, and the environmental lawyer sued again, but this time he lost because the judge found that the company had filled out the permit perfectly. The factory was built, and the people are now breathing polluted air. Story of my life, Tilton said. Nick knew the story too. Isn't that the one where the Bureau of Environmental Security intervened? Didn't it revoke the permit at the first sign of a violation? How do you know so much about it? Nick swallowed, wondering if he'd said too much. The case was part of Janek's file. He put down his glass, deciding to stop for the night. It was on the news. Janek waved a finger in Nick's face. Fuck the BES. Fuck the law. Fuck 'em all. I'm going to do something that's going to make a fucking difference. What are we going to do, John? Nick was on the edge of learning Janek's real plan, which had nothing to do with the wind farm, if he could only tease it out. I'm ready and willing. I'll bet you are. Unsteady, he sat back on the couch. The problem is power, Georgia said. The rich have too much, the poor not enough. We need to speak for the 99% of people who feel powerless. She hadn't had much of the bourbon. That's why I'm here, John. That's why I'm following you. Janek swiveled his head to Georgia. I know, he slurred, and you love me too. He swallowed the last of his bourbon, laid his head on Georgia's lap, and he snored. Nick watched Georgia stroke Janek's hair, and he swallowed a mote of jealousy. He agreed with her at a certain level. He'd seen powerless people in South Asia scraping by day to day, avoiding the bullets and bombs tossed by both sides in the asymmetric war. He often wished he could go beyond the rules of engagement, maybe take out a gang leader or a corrupt official who was bleeding people dry. Corporations back home did the same thing, but in a fancier, sophisticated way. A half hour passed. Janek didn't move. Georgia winced at his awkward position on her leg. Nick reached over and kept him from falling on the floor, while she eased out from under her lover. Her hair brushed against his face as she said, "Thank you." Janek woke everyone up at first light. After a cold breakfast, the horses were readied. Nick took a mental inventory of the gear. An item had been added. One of the canvas coverings was a different shade of green than the others, as if it had been protected from the weather. I don't know anything about you people. Tilton's breath steamed in the morning cold over his folded arms. I've never seen you before. Somebody broke into my shed and stole the explosives. Janek nodded. Promise me something, Tilton said. I don't care what you do to the turbines. He paused, or anything else. But no one gets hurt. I want no part of that. He and Tilton shook hands. As the MEI's horses and hikers rounded a curve in the trail, concealing them from Tilton's house, Georgia halted. We really ought to leave a thank you gift, John. Janek regarded her for a moment. He reached into a saddlebag and removed a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey. Back in a minute. Nick sat on a stump. He heard a pop-pop. What the fuck was that? He knew the answer. Shit, Squirrel said, wide-eyed. Janek returned. Gift delivered. He put the whiskey back in the saddlebag. What the fuck, John? Georgia pulled John away from the animal. We need allies. How are we supposed to change things if we go around shooting our friends? Janek's eyes fixed on the place where Georgia had touched him. Tilton was an idiot. He was soft. He'd squealed at the dog catcher about us. But the terrorist slapped her open-handed across her face. She went down on one knee, whimpering. Nick was frozen in place, wondering if everything was falling apart and he would suffer Tilton's fate. Squirrel was like a statue. Georgia turned to Janix, rage and hurt like boils on her face. Janix dropped to both knees beside her. "I'm sorry, Georgia, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I lost my temper." He lifted her hand and kissed it, first on the back, then on the palm. After a moment's hesitation, Georgia's face softened, and she kissed Janix on the cheek. A maelstrom of feeling flooded Nick, from relief to terror to an irrational happiness at the couple's reconciliation. The maelstrom dissipated, leaving a judgment that Janix was a master manipulator. Georgia and Squirrel were completely in his thrall. Nick caught himself. He had a different purpose. If Janix wasn't stopped, the Mother Earth Insurgency would grow like a tumor. The group said little to each other as they kept to a trail that wound toward the southwest into California. Nick put Tilton's killing out of his mind, along with other bloody images that gave him nightmares. He wondered if his great-grandfather had nightmares after he came back from Vietnam, or if his great-great-uncle thought of the starving faces at Buchenwald in Germany. Nick's father never talked about his dreams, though he awakened his son in the middle of the night with his screams. After the couple with the 3 children were killed, Nick could not go back to fight the Hadjis a third time. The 3 faces haunted him like ghosts. If only I had acted a little sooner. Angela could not imagine living with a traumatized husband. Other wives accepted the burden for better or worse. Angela couldn't. They'd been drifting apart anyway. She'd earned a degree in environmental engineering while he was on his second tour. Spacelift needed new techniques for maintaining human habitations 20 kilometers above sea level, an environment almost as tough as the vacuum of space. Their parting was less painful than Nick had expected, perhaps because she let him see Jason whenever he wanted. On his lowest days, she'd send Jason to a friend and let him stay the night. She never remarried. Fortuna, population 11,000, sat on the north bank of the Eel River, which empties into the Pacific Ocean a few miles to the west. Nick pulled the stolen private truck into a fast food restaurant with a charging station. Janix had ordered him to drive, not checking or not caring if Nick was licensed. The group had ditched the animals at the point where the overland trail met a chip-sealed road leading to the highway. Georgia and Nick pleaded with Janix not to shoot the horses, and they succeeded. The afternoon sun brightened the hills to the north of town, where second and third growth Douglas fir covered most of the terrain once cloaked with redwood fir and spruce. On one of the ridges, Nick saw the target recommended by Squirrel. The 3 wind generators, their thin blades motionless, stood on the crest of the ridge like toothpicks with propellers, waiting to turn the powerful onshore breezes into electricity for San Francisco. While Squirrel bought food, Georgia watched the street. She sidled closer to Janix as he adjusted the tie-downs on their gear. "I'm worried," Georgia said. "Someone's going to find Tilton. The Bessies aren't stupid. Maybe we should lie low for a while to see if there's anyone watching." Nick wanted to give his controller a chance to find him. His comm implants are still blocked from sending or receiving signals outside his immediate compatriots. "We do the job tonight," Janix said. "No time like the present, eh, John?" Squirrel's eagerness was irritating even to Nick. The younger man handed out overcooked tofu chunks, nacho chips, and thin carrot juice. "What are we going to do after the job?" Georgia hissed, "Cop car." A sheriff's cruiser rolled by. Nick turned his attention to the automobile charger, pretending to watch the rising total. The local cops were likely looking for the stolen truck, but the cruiser ignored the terrorists. "Get back in the car, Squirrel," Janix said. Squirrel was fidgety. "You didn't answer my question." Nick stowed the charger plug, and the station declared the bill paid. Georgia climbed into the back with Squirrel. Squirrel said, "Once this is done, I want to stay with you guys." "We'll think about it," Janix said. "You need to get us to the turbines now. Which way?" Squirrel leaned back. He was quiet. Janix turned around in his seat, angry, like Nick's father used to do when he was disobedient. "Which way?" "I want to be part of your movement. I want to take action to make change. We are going to make a big point here. I know other targets up in the hills and further north." Squirrel leaned forward like a kid hoping the adults in the front seat would give him a piece of candy. This was my idea. I got you here. I know the site and the area. You can't abandon me after this job. Take me with you wherever you're going. Nick drove for a half hour. From the road, the turbines materialized and dematerialized like specters, though they grew larger with each reappearance. They came to a cattle fence with a gate posted "No trespassing." Nick parked behind a grove of cottonwoods that hid the truck from the road. "Now we wait for the fog," Squirrel said. "Fog?" Nick said. "Fog rolls in from the coast almost every night this time of year and sticks around until after sunrise, sometimes till mid-morning," Squirrel said. "Sometimes it never lifts. It's perfect cover." Janix opened the glove compartment, removed his pistol, and stuck it in a cup holder. Hours later, Nick opened his eyes. Squirrel had touched him on the shoulder, and he did the same to Georgia. The young men left the car holding the backpack with the Celtex. The other canvas-covered package remained in the truck bed. Janix said nothing about it, and Nick hadn't asked, though the leader was protective of it like a favorite toy. The sky was the color of thin black coffee with a confusing diffuseness. Light from a waxing gibbous moon struggled to get past the fog. Most of the photons got lost in the microscopic droplets of water. A delicate breeze stirred the murkiness. Squirrel set the backpack down by the gate. 5 seconds later, he cut the padlock with a bolt cutter. It swung open with a screech that made Janix reach for his gun. The noise faded, and Squirrel motioned his 3 companions to follow, as if inviting them on a carnival ride. After a half-mile of uphill trudging, a faint fuzziness like the full moon behind a high cloud appeared directly ahead. It resolved into a floodlight that shone on a metal shed, about the same size as Tilton's explosive shed. Other shapes were a backhoe, stacks of construction materials, and piles of gravel. Squirrel played a flashlight beam on the objects. Nick grew aware of a faint, rhythmic, low-frequency whoosh, spaced in a sluggish drumbeat. "The blades," Squirrel pointed his light into the fog deck. "They're turning." "The turbines?" Nick focused upward, but saw nothing. "This way." "What about surveillance?" Nick said. "These rural types leave their front doors unlocked. I'm not worried about it." "Too late to do anything about it now," Janix said. The road continued past the shed. 10 meters later, Nick saw a gray shape similar to the trunk of a tree, but smooth and painted. The dirt around the base of the turbine's tower was rough. A series of closely spaced bolts attached the tower to the foundation. "There's 2 more to the north," Squirrel pointed into the darkness. "They're staggered in such a way that if one falls, it'll take out the other 2 like dominoes." Above the 4 conspirators, the whoosh was louder, but it had the same rhythm. Squirrel stumbled down into the pit where the tower met the foundation. Nick and Georgia followed while Janix stood watch. From the backpack, the anarchist removed the Celtex. Nick held the flashlight on the package. Squirrel took a Swiss Army knife from his pocket, unfolded a short blade, and made the cut as Tilton instructed. Georgia held the pencil-like detonator. "Don't forget the tab." Squirrel gave the Celtex to Nick, and the anarchist pulled off the tab with a smooth twist of his wrist, as if he'd practiced it in his mind. "Do you see it?" Squirrel asked. Georgia awoke her own comm implants. Nick saw her avatar on the 4-node network. Another node appeared, the detonator. He started an app Tilton told her to install. "It's there." Her bright eyes were heightened by the flashlight's bluish glow. "Punch in the code," Squirrel said. In his mind's eye, Nick saw the code entered as star characters. He remembered the gun in Janix's hand at the demonstration. Here was another chance to stop a terrible crime. Last time, pure luck intervened. The situation below the turbine was completely different, but Nick was duty-bound to disrupt the MEI's plan. Nick couldn't sabotage the explosives. Georgia and Squirrel were shoulder to shoulder with him. Janix stood guard a few meters away. "Are you sure we're not being watched, Squirrel?" "Cold feet, Nick?" Georgia turned to Nick. Perhaps she had doubts, or maybe she would ensure Nick followed through on his pledge to make real change. "Just a little nervous. I've never blown anything up before." Georgia shook a little from fright or the chill. Nick couldn't tell. "It's armed," she said. Squirrel placed a Celtex charge on the tower's base. It was enough to turn the conspirators into small, bloody chunks if it went off too soon. He remembered Bobcat's warning to plan an escape route. "Let's give it some space." Nick saw no way to stop the action without exposing himself. He clambered up the dirt. The others followed him to a pile of construction debris 50 feet or so from the tower. "I want to see it go," Squirrel said. "You won't see anything in this fog," Nick said. "Come on," Squirrel said. "Let's get this over with," Georgia said. 10 seconds. Fire in the hole." The explosion rent the air like a percussive knife, and a flash of white light bounced off the base of the fog deck. Construction debris tumbled onto Nick. Dry vegetation caught fire, and the orange light flickered off the pylon. The explosion pushed a mass of dirt away from the pit, and scorch marks radiated upward around the tower's base. "Fuck," Squirrel said. "It wasn't enough." "Let's get out of here," Nick said. "Wait," Squirrel said. "I left the bag at the pylon." "Shit," Georgia said. "It's probably in pieces," Squirrel said. "You lost it," Janix said. "You get it." Squirrel nodded and raced to the tower. Janix raised his weapon, ready to shoot the anarchist in the back. There was a crack and a tearing, not unlike the sound aluminum foil makes, only deeper in tone. Bolts popped like bullets. Janix lowered the gun, surprised. "It's coming down," Squirrel yelled. Janix, Nick, and Georgia didn't wait for Squirrel. The fire had offered enough light to see the road. Nick glanced over his shoulder. The tower leaned over, but not in the direction they had planned. It leaned toward him, Georgia, and Squirrel, falling toward the road, threatening to crush all three. Nick ran as if chased by a wolf, grabbing Georgia's jacket and pulling her along. She struggled to keep up. They had only seconds. "Wait for me, please, please!" Squirrel tripped, and he sprawled on the ground. His flashlight rolled a few feet away, though it shone on his prone figure. The point of a wind turbine blade impaled him. The sight of a blade sticking out of the road like an arrow stopped Nick in his tracks. He heard a metallic snap above him, and he imagined the blade breaking where it met the rotor head. To his right, he heard a crash, likely the rest of the turbine hitting the ground. Janix and Georgia were far ahead. Nick turned to run, but the atmosphere was a wall of black. The falling turbine had taken out the lamp over the construction shed. Squirrel's flashlight, still shining, beckoned. Nick picked up the light and pointed the beam at Squirrel. The blade had hit him squarely in his sternum, and by the time the gravel road stopped its momentum, the blade had sliced him in two, as clean as a chef's knife. Nick swallowed. Janix had come back. "Let's go." He was dead anyway. They hurried to the truck. Nick shook his head to dislodge the impressions of Squirrel's already opaque eyes. Part 4. With Nick in the driver's seat of the stolen truck, the trio headed into town hunting for another vehicle, as local cops rushed to the wrecked turbines. Nick concentrated on navigating the unfamiliar streets, but the image of Squirrel's mangled body interfered, bringing back memories of the village deaths he blamed on himself. Did he again cause an innocent's death? Squirrel wasn't guiltless, but the sabotage wouldn't have killed anyone directly. Perhaps he could have persuaded Janix to find a different target, or tipped off local police, or called in the BES cavalry. However, he still didn't know Janix's ultimate aim, though the canvas-wrapped package had something to do with it. The terrorists guarded it as if it were gold bullion, never giving Nick a chance to examine it. On the edge of town, Georgia singled out a private sedan. As she picked the electronic lock, Nick hoped she sent an inadvertent signal. The state vehicle registry would note the theft and the method, and the authorities might make the connection to the turbine sabotage. Or perhaps Georgia had a more cunning approach, misdirecting the authorities and his controller. Without comm access, he had no way to know. The group switched vehicles every few hundred kilometers as they made their way south. Janix said nothing about the destination. Neither did Georgia, which could only mean she already knew. As they gradually swung east, the kilometers ticking by, an awareness came over Nick as they skirted the remnants of Phoenix its inhabitants decamped to areas with reliable water. They were going to a familiar location, even though he'd never set foot there. If Nick had a pair of binoculars, he might have spotted the structure a few degrees above the horizon. "John, I'm tired of asking you, where are we going?" "Someplace wonderful." A chill went up Nick's spine, like the shimmers of heat off the desert. "Someplace wonderful" was the slogan attracting the hyper-wealthy to the luxury apartments at the top of the spacelift tower. Angela was there, along with Jason. Were they in danger? Was it time to break cover? Nick hesitated. He still didn't know what Janix had in mind. He needed to stay patient. He didn't want to give away his connection to the tower if that was Janix's target. The trio continued east, and once they were past Mount Graham, the tower resolved first as a vertical black line perpendicular to the horizon, then a gray-white line as the sun fell towards the Pacific Ocean. Janix watched the object as if it were a lodestone, beguiling him with invisible magic. Nick had never seen it in life, only in pictures on the ComNet and from Angela. The tower's hair-thin profile resolved into pencil thinness. An hour later, it resembled a tubular tower sunk directly into the ground. Nick stopped to recharge their pilfered van. He, Georgia, and Janix could not take their eyes off the structure. Nick forgot the danger he faced, transfixed as the tower disappeared into the heavens like Jacob's ladder. "How tall is it again, John?" Her head tipped back, Georgia shielded her eyes against the sun's glare, despite her sunglasses. 20 kilometers. Twice as high as subsonic jetliners fly. "Obscene," Georgia said. "We'll fix that soon enough." Janix directed Nick to a motel a block off the highway. When Nick reached for the canvas bag, Janix pushed away his arm and lifted the bag himself. As the sun set behind the mountains, and even as the stars poked out from the purpling sky, the top of the tower stayed illuminated. The Terminator climbed the shaft as night swallowed it like a worm, until the superstructure at the top, its details invisible from the ground, winked out in a flash of reflection off its multifaceted glass. Its inhabitants called it the Capitol because it reminded them of the top of an ancient Greek column. As twilight turned to darkness, strobes set every 500 meters warned aircraft of the tower's presence. "Soros," Janix said, "inside. Close the door." Nick tore himself away from the tower, wondering what his wife would think if she knew he was near. Would Jason be excited to see him? What did Janix want? On the motel room bed was a flat palm-sized device, the empty canvas bag, and an olive-drab metallic object shaped like a teardrop, the rounded end the size of a basketball. A faded yellow decal covered a portion. Nick recognized the trefoil warning of a radiation hazard. "Fuck," he said. Janix cocked his pistol. "Call your wife, Nick." The pieces fell into place. "You knew all along," Nick said. "Cops everywhere are idiots. They are as dumb as the petty criminals they catch. Even the cops that go after so-called terrorists. They're mirror images of one another. Takes one to know one, eh? You thought you knew me, but you didn't." Was Janix right? Was the BES arrogant enough to think it could fool a man as intelligent as John Janix? Or did Nick's bureau controller know that Janix would unmask him? "When did you know?" 5 minutes after you walked out the BES door. Everyone is after me. I heard from friends of friends that the BES had sent someone. I was going to kill you." "At the riot?" "Then you got me out from under the Seattle cops. That was a close call for me, I'll admit. Keep your enemies close, the old adage says, so I brought you along." "It was my idea, Nick." Georgia had removed the staser and held it on her lap. "It took a while, but I found you in the public databases and learned that your wife works for Spacelift. That's what we needed, a way to get in." "Your bait, Soros." Janix licked his lips. "Your ex is the key to the door." Nick felt humiliated. That was the hardest thing to take after the village incident. He felt guilty, to be sure, but the humiliation of failure was the thing that hurt most. "You're going to take down the tower with a nuke." He glanced at the canvas bag. The suitcase scenario. You were closer than you thought when you joked about the Mk-54 back in Tequilma. The Army decommissioned all the Davy Crockett's, but it still knew how to build them. Tilton was a specialist on the secret project to have some on hand, just in case. He was a clever man. As he said, Janix murdered Tilton to cover his tracks. Did Nick's BES controller know about the homebrew nukes and didn't tell him? With intelligence routinely compartmentalized, it was possible. He couldn't hold it against her, but the mounting number of unanswered questions was maddening. You asked me about breaking nuke codes. A hint to keep you following the trail. I didn't want you running away in the night. Strung along like a puppy on a leash, Nick thought. And the direct action at the wind turbines was a diversion, I suppose. You're catching on, Nick. The cops will swarm over the area for days while we finish our task here. Now, call your wife. She's my ex-wife. What about Jason? I've lifted the mask, Georgia said. We're listening in, so don't say or do anything stupid. The electronic masking hid me from the world and the world from me, Nick sighed at the realization, like putting a hood over a hostage's head. Janix cocked his pistol. Enough fucking around. Call Angela. Tell her to come here. Invite her for a nooner. Georgia snickered. Nick didn't have the luxury to take offense. In his mind's eye, he saw his contacts app, and he dialed Angela. He made up an excuse about traveling through the area on business. Sorry for surprising her, but was she available for lunch? No, don't bring Jason. Nick was only in town for a couple of hours. He didn't want to get him excited and then disappoint him by leaving right away. She's meeting me at the visitor center, Nick said. There's a cafe there. Perfect. Good job, Nick. Janix grinned. 20 minutes later, the trio arrived at the spacelift site. The visitor center was outside the main security gate at the edge of a fenced perimeter around the tower. The heat of the day had settled in. We'll wait outside, Janix said. No point in announcing to the world that we're here. The center's glass walls and undulating roof resembled an airport terminal. A reader board outside the main entrance listed the shuttle and freight rocket takeoffs and landings from the launch platform. Per kilo freight prices had come down so much, Angela said, that private launches were scheduled 2 years in advance. No one except the government ordered the big first-stage lifting rockets anymore. The investors were already building a second tower in India. The reader board grid dissolved into for-lease listings of the apartments in the capital. Nick couldn't afford even one if he had 10 jobs. Georgia sneered. The ultimate gated community. Angela stepped out of a car. Every atom of Nick wanted to scream at her to run, and her look of concern didn't ease his fears for her. She knew something was wrong, and Nick had no chance to warn her away without risking injury or death at Janix or Georgia's hands. Though they saw each other occasionally by video, he hadn't been in her presence for years. Angela was more attractive than ever because she had lost her girlishness and matured into a woman Nick doubted he could ever satisfy emotionally. He blinked to suppress his feelings as he puzzled a way out of the trouble he'd caused. Nick and Angela greeted each other. He relaxed a bit when she said Jason was in school in the capital 20 kilometers above them. He'd be safe if he could stop the MEI. Janix and Georgia sidled up. In the motel, both had showered and changed into business attire. Nick bathed as well, Janix's gun on him the entire time. You're going to do exactly as I say, Angela, Janix said. How do you know my name? Her eyes widened when she saw the pistol. Who's she? Georgia remained silent. She shifted a black nylon bag on her shoulder. It held the nuke. Angela, Nick said, I'm sorry for this. I had to lie to you. This man and woman will kill us if we don't cooperate. He didn't say that Janix might kill them anyway, with either the nuclear blast or a bullet. Angela turned pale. We're going inside the gate, and you're going to take us to the elevator, Angela, Janix said. We're DOD officials, and we're here for a security audit. That's the story. Clear? Nick, these people are crazy. They'll never get past the gate. We've prepared for this, Angela, Janix said. Rest assured. What do I say about Nick? The truth, Janix shrugged. He happened to be in town. He's an ordinary visitor. Angela followed Janix's instructions. Nick's comm connection showed the guards at the main gate accessing his credentials. He hoped his controller accounted for this possibility when setting up his aliases. He imagined a bloody shootout as Janix and Georgia fought their way in. She could take out the security bot with her staser. The guards didn't even bother to check Georgia's nylon bag. The bot remained impassive. Nick could only guess that Georgia had hacked the security database to ensure a green light. He rejected as impossible the chance of inside help. The BES was as ideologically pure as any police force. He couldn't shake a surreal twisting in his gut. Everything had come apart. He'd learned Janix's ultimate goal, detonate a nuclear device at the spacelift tower, probably to bring it down, but he couldn't take what he knew to be his BES bosses as planned. Were they able to monitor him through Georgia's masking? The passivity of the guards and the SecBot argued against it. An automated ground shuttle took them to the elevator foyer. No one else was in the shuttle. Janix sat with Angela, the tip of his pistol pointed at her hip bone. Sweat trickled down the nape of her neck. Beside him, Georgia had her finger on the staser's trigger. The staser rested on the hidden nuke in the bag on her lap. The shuttle let them off at the elevator loading platform. Nick couldn't resist craning his neck upward. He remembered the basics of the tower, a series of high-pressure inflated cylinders 230 meters in diameter, one on top of the other like a legless millipede set on end. Each segment was made of Kevlar fiber-reinforced metallic materials. The foundation went several kilometers into the ground. No guy wires kept the structure perpendicular, flywheels kept it stable. Far above, out of sight, hundreds of wind turbines powered the tower, the residential apartments, and the launch platform 20,000 meters away. Janix's idea was simple. Take out one of the sections, and the structure would fall over, just like the wind generators at Fortuna. But one or two people could not carry enough conventional explosives to damage a segment. An Mk-54, however, yielded the energy of 10 to 20 tons of TNT, enough to level a couple of city blocks. If Janix could take out a big enough chunk of a segment, the tower would keel over at the weak point, the same way the leaning tree at Tequilma snapped at the wedge excised from the trunk. The elevator car arrived. Nick's mind raced to find an answer. How could he stop the Mother Earth Insurgency? Maybe Janix wanted to detonate the device at the Capitol. The explosion would be seen as far away as California, perhaps from space. Or maybe he wanted to hijack one of the shuttles to the orbiting Branson Hotel and blow it up. Janix's psychological profile didn't suggest a suicide mission, but Nick didn't trust it now. The agent was sure of one thing. He and Angela would be expendable sooner rather than later. The elevator doors opened, and a handful of passengers exited. "Daddy!" How many ticks of the clock pass when you instinctively know your son's life is in danger? Nick was able to count them, though only 3 meters separated him from his son, and the 8-year-old boy, his curly hair bouncing like a beach ball, closed with him like a fighter interceptor. Janix and Georgia turned their heads to the distraction, as did Angela, but Nick already had a plan. He knew how to take advantage of a new tactical condition. He placed his powerful hands on each side of Jason's chest, as if ready to lift him in an embrace. Instead, he handed him to Angela, and using his son as a counterweight, kicked Janix in the chest, knocking him into Georgia. Angela caught Jason awkwardly, stumbling away from the elevator. Janix and Georgia, still carrying the nuke, fell toward the elevator door and caromed inside. Nick, off balance, managed to snag the closing door with one hand and pull himself inside. The door closed behind him and he crashed into a padded seat. The elevator rose, but not straight up. As the car cleared the shelter, Nick felt the vibration as the long, narrow, self-powered track, like a moving caterpillar without the undulations, carried the plumb-level car on its back at a 45-degree angle along the outside of the tubular tower. It spiraled upward, following an invisible trail on the tube's surface at a perpendicular rate of 2.5 meters a second. A one-way trip to the top would take a little more than 2 hours if it weren't interrupted. The car had 24 seats arranged in 2 banks, with an aisle between them. Glass surrounded the car, except for the floor, the ceiling, and on the tower side. Nick was at one end. Janix and Georgia were at the other. Janix's gun was at Nick's feet. Georgia observed, "It's 2 against 1. Nick showed Janix's lost gun in his hand. "The odds are more even than you think." They were at a standoff. The car was too narrow for either Janix or Georgia to flank Nick, who said, "The best you can do is cover Janix while he arms the nuke." As if taking Nick's instruction, Janix removed the device and its controller, which looked like an old-style smartphone. "Giving your life for a cause is a matter of timing, Nick. I didn't think my chance would come this soon." Georgia was the bigger chink in Janix's armor. Could he chip at her loyalty? Nick said, "Is that what you want, Georgia, to die a hero for the cause?" Flustered but uncertain whether to argue with her lover, Georgia fussed with the arming device at Janix's order while he held the staser on Nick. She knew the procedures and the codes, but the BES agent saw the doubt and hesitation in the way her hands trembled. "You wanted to watch the boom, Georgia, not be in it." "This isn't a joke," Georgia said. "The world is about to careen off the edge of a cliff. Someone has to stop people from taking advantage of the planet's pain. This tower is a monstrosity. It has to come down." Janix had the smugness of the righteous. "You're the one who didn't expect to die, Nick." Of course he didn't plan things in that way. As a soldier, the risk of death went with the territory. He'd been the cause of enough in South Asia. Undercover, he only wanted to get information and feed it to his bosses and let them worry about the next steps. He didn't expect to be the last redoubt between order and chaos, at least in an elevator car crawling up the side of the world's tallest freestanding structure. "I don't have anything better to do at this point except try and stop you." Georgia announced that the bomb was armed. When the timer was started, they'd have 1 minute to get away from the blast. Janix and Nick said little, glaring at each other like two suspicious alley cats. "What are we waiting for?" Janix said. Georgia's eyes flicked between her lover and Nick. "John, why don't we wait until we get to the top? A fireball will be seen for hundreds of miles. We'll have a chance to find shelter before the nuke goes off." She was grasping at straws, Nick thought. "I want this tower on the ground," Janix said. "I can't think of anything more spectacular and terrifying than that." Nick detected the fear in Janix. All along, Nick had tried with small gestures, felling the tree, helping with the horses, ignoring a cold-blooded murder, to gain Janix's trust. Though he'd been played, perhaps he had leverage. "Everyone knows there's injustice in the world, John. Why go silent?" Georgia bit her lip. "I don't want to die, John. Who will fight after we're gone?" Nick said, "I can speak up for you, Georgia, in court, if we survive this, and you're captured." "I don't believe in your corrupt courts." Her point was sincere, but it rang hollow in the near-empty car. Janix measured her attitude, and Nick observed doubts cross his face. He looked as if he wanted to take the nuke's controller away from her, but she gripped it tightly. "Georgia, John will sacrifice you just as sure as he will sacrifice himself and me." Outside the car, drones buzzed the windows, but there was no place to land and they weren't big enough to carry a rescue team. Whoever operated them could watch but do nothing. Nick estimated an hour or more had passed, which meant that the car had risen halfway up the tower, 10 kilometers above sea level, give or take. He had no time to take in the view. The cold would freeze a man in a few minutes if he didn't die of oxygen deprivation first, or get blown away like a leaf in the stratospheric winds. The standoff was exhausting. Nick was dehydrated and his muscles stiffened in his crouch behind the seats. He had no choice but to bide his time, waiting for the right moment. Life or death for hundreds of people, not just himself, Georgia and Janix, hung on his timing, and even then he might fail. Janix also waited, perhaps silently persuaded by Georgia that a chance for life was better than a wasted death. Georgia was resolute in her own way. She could not oppose the man she loved. The next few seconds ended everything. One of the drones, at the edge of its operational limit, wobbled and tapped the glass. Startled, Georgia dropped the controller. It tumbled toward Nick, but Janix got to it first. In the scramble, Janix lowered the staser, and Nick saw his chance. He fired the pistol, striking the padded seat next to Janix's head. The seat absorbed the bullet and its energy. Janix laughed and touched the final key on the controller. A voice announced a countdown. Georgia rushed for the controller in Janix's hand, and they struggled over it. She preferred life over death. Nick fired again, grazing Janix on the neck. He yelped, instinctively raising his hand to his wound, the hand with the staser, and as it came up, it went off. A hole opened in the glass. The pressurized atmosphere in the car emptied like a balloon, blowing Georgia and the bomb through the opening. Caught in the high winds of the stratosphere, she flew off perpendicular to the tower before dropping away toward the earth. Nick hung onto a seat, his body half out of the hole in the glass, while yellow oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, teasing him with life-giving gas. The nuke detonated. The flash was like a signal, and Nick braced himself. His body had experienced 100 detonations in country. A second and a half later, the shock wave hit the car, weaker than he expected. He slipped further, and he felt a hand on his wrist. Janix pulled, and Nick found purchase enough to pull himself inside. The two men's eyes met. Nick did not have time to say thanks. A bullet from the drone ripped into Janix's torso, and Nick watched his body tumble away through the opening in the glass. His clothing billowed like a sail, caught in the slipstream in the tower's lee. A drone orbited a few meters from the car. Nick expected to fall with the tower to the earth. He felt the cold in the wind and his gasping breath. He donned a dangling mask, and the tower remained upright. 2 more people had died, but no more innocents. The damaged elevator car reversed itself and spiraled down the tower at its same steady rate. With Georgia gone, the last blocks on Nick's link with the ComNet vanished, and he alerted his BES boss. She had followed him the whole time, and once the agency realized that Janix was after the tower, they mounted an extraction, but the bureaucracy behaved in its usual dawdling ways. The nuke had fallen about half the distance to the ground before detonating, but it had also traveled horizontally. By the time it went off, the blast was too far away to do serious damage to a structure designed to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. The elevator's outer doors at the base opened as if nothing had happened. A BES medic gave Nick a once-over and pronounced him sound, ignoring the uncertain effects of gamma rays from the nuke. The BES agent picked up Jason and held him tight, apologizing for throwing him at his mother. Angela embraced Nick, glad he was safe and that Jason still had a father. It felt almost like his homecoming after his second tour, relief that a difficult task was done, and anticipation for a bit of rest. Maybe he would talk to Angela about living closer or see if Spacelift needed security help. The family walked back to the visitors center for a burger. When he asked Jason if he'd like to go for a hike in pretty mountains, his son offered a big smile. Thanks for listening to my novelette, The Mother Earth Insurgency. It's book 1 of my series, Tales from a Warming Planet. You'll find links to the book in the caption of this video. The book is available free of charge on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. As a special bonus, the ebook includes the first chapter of Book 2, Carbon Run. You'll also find links to Books 3 and 4, City of Ice and Dreams, and Restoration, as well as links to more videos. Until next time.